heat rises. Every frontier settler knew this. Heat rises from the stove, rises through the cabin air, rises to the ceiling, and then, if the builder has done everything else right, stays in the cabin, trapped by the roof and walls, warming the family below. But there is a hole in every cabin that defeats this principle, a hole that the builder put there deliberately, a hole that is absolutely necessary and absolutely destructive. The chimney. The chimney is a vertical tunnel that connects the hottest part of the cabin interior to the coldest air outside. Its purpose is to carry smoke and combustion gases out of the living space, and it performs this function by exploiting the same principle that traps heat in the cabin. Hot air rises. The hot gases from the fire rise through the chimney, creating a draft that pulls fresh air into the firebox from below, sustaining combustion. The system is elegant and essential. It is also, thermally, a catastrophe. A standard frontier chimney, built from fieldstone or brick, 8 to 12 inches square in the interior flue, rising 6 to 8 feet from the firebox to the chimney cap, functioned as a heat exhaust pipe. The combustion gases entering the flue at the firebox were approximately 400 to 600 degrees. By the time they exited the chimney cap, they were still 150 to 250 degrees, meaning that 2/3 of the heat energy in those gases had been carried out of the cabin and dumped into the sky. A well-built stove might convert 60% of the wood's energy into usable cabin heat. The chimney then reclaimed 20 to 30% of that heat and threw it away. The net thermal efficiency of a typical frontier stove and chimney system was approximately 40 to 50%, meaning that half of every log, half of every cord, half of every day spent felling and splitting and hauling wood was wasted, its energy carried up the chimney in a column of hot gas that warmed nothing but the winter sky. Every frontier builder accepted this waste as the price of having a fire indoors. The chimney had to draft. The draft required hot gases rising. Hot gases rising meant heat leaving. There was no solution. Georgi Bagration had a solution. Georgi had arrived in the Green Mountains of Vermont in the spring of 1888, traveling east from New York with his wife Nino, their son Vakhtang, who was 12, and their daughter Ketavan, who was 9. He was 44 years old, a tall man with a narrow, weathered face, deep-set dark eyes under heavy black brows, a prominent hooked nose, a thick black beard going silver at the chin, and the rough, enormous hands of someone who had spent decades working with stone. In the mountain village of Shatili, in the Khevsureti region of the Georgian Caucasus, Georgi had been a stone mason, a builder of the tower houses that dotted the high valleys of the Caucasus like fortresses, which in many cases they were. The Georgians understood stone the way the Ukrainians understood earth, and the Persians understood heat, not as a dead material, but as a living partner in the building, a substance that absorbed, stored, and released energy in ways that transformed the relationship between a house and its climate. The Caucasus Mountains, where winter temperatures dropped to 20 below zero and snow-buried villages to the roof lines, demanded buildings that could survive extreme cold with minimal fuel, because wood was scarce at the elevations where the tower houses stood. The Georgian solution was thermal mass. The tower house walls were 3 to 4 feet thick, built from stacked fieldstone with rubble and clay fill, presenting a massive thermal barrier that absorbed heat during the day and released it at night, moderating the interior temperature swings that thinner walls could not prevent. But the walls were only part of the Georgian thermal strategy. The heart of the system was the buxari, the traditional Georgian fireplace and chimney, which was not a narrow flue, but a massive structure of stone that occupied the entire center of the building. The buxari's chimney was not a pipe. It was a wall 3 feet wide, 2 feet deep, and rising the full height of the building, built from the same dense fieldstone as the walls, weighing several thousand pounds, and functioning not as a smoke exhaust, but as a heat storage device that happened to also carry smoke. The principle was simple: a narrow chimney, 8 inches square, thin-walled, heated quickly and cooled quickly, absorbing almost no heat from the passing gases and transmitting almost none to the room. A massive chimney, 3 feet wide, 2 feet deep, with walls 12 to 18 inches thick, absorbed enormous quantities of heat from the passing gases and released that heat slowly into the room over hours. The narrow chimney was a pipe. The massive chimney was a radiator. The narrow chimney wasted heat. The massive chimney captured it. Georgie looked at the Vermont chimneys and saw the same failure he had seen in every American building: a thin-walled stone flue, 8 to 12 inches square, rising through the roof with a total mass of perhaps 500 to 800 pounds. The flue carried hot gases from the firebox to the sky and captured almost none of their energy. The Vermonters had built their chimneys to the minimum dimensions needed to carry smoke, an approach that made sense if you thought of the chimney as a pipe, but that was thermally insane if you understood that the chimney was the single largest pathway for heat loss in the building. The cabin that Georgie rented for the first winter, a standard Vermont sugar cabin, 12 by 16 feet, with a fieldstone chimney and a cast-iron stove, confirmed his assessment. The stove burned well. The cabin heated adequately during active fire. But the moment the fire died, the cabin cooled rapidly, and a significant portion of the cooling came not from heat loss through the walls and roof, but from the chimney itself, which reversed its role after the fire died. Instead of carrying hot gases up, the cold chimney now conducted cold air down, creating a reverse draft that pulled frigid outside air into the cabin through the cold flue. The chimney that had been an exhaust pipe during the fire became an intake pipe after the fire, and the cold air pouring down the flue could drop the cabin temperature 5 to 8 degrees in the first hour after the fire died, on top of the normal heat loss through the walls and roof. Nino tolerated the first winter. She did not tolerate the cold chimney draft. She told Georgie in March of 1889 that the cabin was colder after the fire died than it should be, and that the cold was coming from the chimney, not the walls. She was correct. Georgie had felt the same thing, a persistent cold current flowing from the chimney area into the room, chilling everything in its path, defeating the residual warmth that should have persisted for hours after a good fire. Georgie built his chimney in the summer of 1889 on a new cabin that he constructed on a parcel of cleared land in the Green Mountain foothills. The cabin was 14 by 18 feet, 252 square feet, built from maple and beech logs cut from the property, chinked with clay and lime mortar, roofed with cedar shakes. The chimney was the centerpiece of the construction, and it was unlike anything the Vermont neighbors had ever seen. The chimney was 3 feet wide, 2 feet deep, and rose 12 feet from the firebox to the chimney cap. The exterior dimensions were approximately 4 feet wide and 3 feet deep, including the 12-inch thick stone walls on all 4 sides. The flue, the interior passage through which the smoke traveled, was 12 inches wide and 8 inches deep, centered within the massive stone structure. The flue was not straight. It followed a zigzag path, rising 12 inches, then turning 90 degrees and running horizontally for 18 inches, then turning 90 degrees and rising another 12 inches, creating a serpentine channel that forced the hot gases to travel approximately 24 feet of path length through a chimney that was only 12 feet tall. The extended path length meant that the hot gases were in contact with the stone walls of the flue for twice as long as they would be in a straight flue, transferring twice as much heat into the stone mass before exiting the chimney cap. The construction took 3 weeks, far longer than the 2 to 3 days required for a conventional chimney, and consumed approximately 4 tons of fieldstone gathered from the property's stone walls and creek beds, plus 600 pounds of clay and lime mortar mixed on site. The total weight of the completed chimney was approximately 8,000 pounds, 10 times the weight of a conventional chimney and more than the combined weight of all 4 cabin walls. The chimney required its own foundation, a pad of flat stones 18 inches thick, set on undisturbed subsoil beneath the cabin floor, to support the concentrated load without settling. If you want to know what happened when a Georgian stone mason built a chimney that weighed more than the cabin itself, while every neighbor said he was building a monument instead of a fireplace, subscribe to this channel and tell me in the comments where you are watching from. The firebox was built into the base of the chimney, an opening 18 inches wide, 12 inches deep, and 14 inches tall, lined with the densest stone Georgie could find on the property, a dark gray granite that resisted spalling under repeated heating and cooling cycles. The firebox was smaller than a conventional frontier fireplace, deliberately so because Georgie did not want a large fire. He wanted a small, hot fire that burned cleanly and completely, producing the maximum temperature in the flue gases with the minimum quantity of wood. A large smoky fire in a conventional chimney wasted fuel and coated the flue with creosote. A small hot fire in the massive chimney transferred more of its energy into the stone walls and less into unburned smoke and soot. The stove was a simple cast iron box, not the elaborate stoves of the Yankee tradition, but a plain rectangular firebox with a flat top for cooking and a front-loading door, connected to the chimney's flue entrance by a short section of stovepipe that entered the chimney at the base of the zigzag channel. The stove functioned as the combustion chamber, and the massive chimney functioned as the heat exchanger and storage device. The total cost of the chimney, excluding Georgie's own labor, which was considerable, was $28. $18 for lime and sand for the mortar, $6 for the iron stovepipe and fittings connecting the stove to the flue, and $4 for the cast iron damper plate that Georgie installed at the base of the flue, which could be partially closed after the fire died to prevent the reverse draft that had plagued the rented cabin. The first test came on the evening of October 15th, 1889. Georgie loaded the stove with a charge of seasoned beech, approximately 8 pounds of dense hardwood, at 6 in the evening and let it burn at moderate draft. The stove reached full temperature in 30 minutes, and the hot gases, approximately 500 degrees at the flue entrance, entered the base of the zigzag channel and began their serpentine journey through the massive stone structure. The gases traveled upward 12 inches, turned and ran horizontally 18 inches, turned and rose again, repeating the zigzag pattern 6 times before reaching the chimney cap, where they exited at approximately 120 degrees, 380 degrees cooler than when they entered. 380 degrees of heat energy had been absorbed by the stone walls of the zigzag channel. 4 tons of fieldstone, 8,000 pounds, had captured the heat that a conventional chimney would have dumped into the sky. And now the stone was warm, not hot. The exterior surface of the chimney, facing into the cabin, had risen from the ambient 62 degrees to approximately 85 degrees. A gentle warmth, like standing beside a sun-heated boulder in autumn. The warmth was radiating into the cabin from all four exposed faces of the chimney, filling the room with a soft, even heat that was fundamentally different from the sharp directional heat of the stove itself. The stove produced radiant heat in a narrow cone, hot near the stove, warm at 4 feet, cool at 8 feet, cold in the corners. The chimney produced radiant heat from a massive surface. The entire 12-foot height and 3-foot width of the chimney face radiated warmth evenly into the room, reaching the corners, the ceiling, the floor, every surface. The stove heated a zone. The chimney heated the room. The fire burned for approximately 2 hours, consuming the 8-pound charge of beech and dying to coals by 8 in the evening. In a conventional cabin, this would be the beginning of the cooling. The stove would be cold by 9:30. The cabin would lose 10 degrees by midnight, and someone would reload the stove before bed or accept a cold morning. But the massive chimney had absorbed the equivalent of approximately 18,000 BTUs of thermal energy during the 2-hour burn. And it was now releasing that energy into the cabin at a rate of approximately 1,000 BTUs per hour. Georgie closed the damper to 1/4 open, enough to allow the residual smoke and gases to escape, but not enough to allow a significant reverse draft of cold air down the flue. The damper was a critical element of the system. Without it, the cold night air would flow down the chimney after the fire died, stealing heat from the stone walls on its way down and entering the cabin as a cold draft. With the damper nearly closed, the air movement through the flue was reduced to a trickle, and the stone walls retained their heat rather than surrendering it to a column of descending cold air. The cabin temperature at 8 in the evening, when the fire died, was 67 degrees. At 10, it was 63. At midnight, 59. At 2 in the morning, 55. At 4, 52. At 6, when Georgie woke, 49. The total overnight drop was 18 degrees over 10 hours, less than 2 degrees per hour, compared to the 30-degree drop over 8 hours in the rented cabin with its conventional chimney. The massive chimney had extended the cabin's thermal coasting time from approximately 4 hours to approximately 10 hours, and the dawn temperature of 49 degrees was 15 degrees warmer than the 34 degrees that would have greeted the family in a conventional cabin. And the chimney was still warm at 6 in the morning. Georgie placed his palm on the stone face and felt a gentle warmth. Perhaps 70 degrees, down from the 85 of the previous evening, still radiating heat into the room, still contributing to the cabin's temperature, 10 hours after the fire had died. The stone mass was not exhausted. It had released approximately 10,000 of its 18,000 stored BTUs and still held 8,000 in reserve, enough to continue radiating for another 6 to 8 hours at a declining rate. The chimney was not just a heat storage device. It was a thermal flywheel that smoothed the wild temperature oscillations of a conventional stove and chimney system into a gentle, nearly constant warmth. If this story has touched you, share it and subscribe, because the quiet engineering that kept families alive and farms running for generations deserves to be remembered. The fuel savings were immediate and dramatic. Before the massive chimney, Georgie's rented cabin consumed approximately 4.5 cords of mixed hardwood per winter, a typical figure for a Vermont cabin of that size. After the massive chimney, The first winter's consumption dropped to approximately 2 3/4 cords, a 39% reduction. The savings came from three sources. First, the chimney captured heat that a conventional chimney exhausted. Approximately 30% of the flue heat that would normally be wasted was absorbed by the stone mass and returned to the cabin. Second, the damper eliminated the reverse draft that cooled conventional cabins after the fire died, a source of heat loss that was invisible but significant, accounting for 5 to 10% of total heat loss. Third, the thermal mass of the chimney reduced the peak-to-trough temperature swing, which meant fewer high-burn recovery cycles and more efficient, moderate-burn, steady-state operation. The neighbors noticed the chimney before they entered the cabin. The structure was visible from 100 yards, a massive stone column rising from the center of the cabin roof, 3 times the width and twice the depth of any chimney in the valley. Everett Whipple, who farmed the adjacent parcel, described it as a church steeple made of river rock and asked Georgie why he had built a chimney that weighed more than his cabin. Georgie invited him inside. Whipple visited on a January morning in 1890 when the outdoor temperature was 6 degrees. He arrived at 7:30 and found the cabin at 52 degrees. The fire had been out since the previous evening, approximately 11 hours, and the chimney face was warm to the touch. Georgie relit the stove with a small charge of birch kindling and a single beech log, and within 30 minutes the cabin was climbing past 60 degrees, aided by the chimney mass, which was still warm and which heated faster than a cold chimney because it started from a higher baseline temperature. By 8 o'clock, the cabin was 64 degrees. Whipple put his hand on the chimney face and held it there for 30 seconds, feeling the steady, deep warmth radiating from the stone into his palm. He asked how much wood Georgie burned. 2 3/4 cords. Whipple burned 4 1/2. He asked how often Georgie woke in the night to feed the stove. Never. Whipple woke every night at 2. He asked how much the chimney cost. $28. He said nothing for a long time. Whipple did not build a massive chimney. The construction was beyond his skill. The zigzag flue channel, the stone selection, the mortar work, the damper installation all required masonry expertise that Whipple did not possess and could not afford to hire. This was the limitation of the massive chimney, unlike the straw cellar, which required only a spade and patience, or the sand bed, which required only a box and free sand. The massive chimney required genuine skill in stone masonry. The zigzag flue had to be proportioned correctly. Too tight, and the draft would be insufficient, causing smoke to back up into the cabin. Too loose, and the gases would pass through too quickly, failing to transfer their heat to the stone. The mortar joints had to be tight and heat-resistant. A cracked joint in the flue would leak smoke into the cabin and eventually into the cabin walls, creating a fire hazard. The damper had to be positioned and operated correctly. Too closed, and the cabin would fill with carbon monoxide. Too open, and the reverse draft would steal the stored heat. Georgie offered to build a chimney for Whipple at cost, $28 for materials plus $12 for his labor, a total of $40. Whipple considered the offer through the winter of 1890, watching his woodpile shrink and his sleep fragment, and accepted in March. Georgie built Whipple's chimney in April 1890, before spring planting consumed Whipple's time and attention. The construction took 2.5 weeks, faster than Georgie's first chimney because the technique was refined and the site was simpler. Whipple's chimney was slightly smaller, 2.5 feet wide, 2 feet deep, with a 4-turn zigzag rather than 6. reflecting the smaller size of Whipple's cabin and a pragmatic decision to reduce the cost and construction time. The smaller chimney weighed approximately 5,000 pounds and stored proportionally less heat, but the performance was still dramatic. Whipple's first full winter with the massive chimney produced a fuel consumption of 3 cords, down from 4.5, an overnight temperature drop of 20 degrees, down from 30, and a dawn temperature of 46 degrees, up from 32. Whipple told everyone in the valley about his chimney, not with the reserve of a New England farmer reluctant to admit he had been wrong, but with the enthusiasm of a man who had slept through the night for the first time in 6 Vermont winters. His testimony, delivered at the general store, at church, at the spring cattle auction, was simple and specific. The massive chimney saved 1.5 cords of wood per winter, which was worth $9. It eliminated the 2 o'clock fire feeding, and the cabin was warmer at dawn than it had been at midnight under the old system. The $40 investment would pay for itself in 4 winters on fuel alone, and the sleep benefit was beyond price. By the winter of 1893, Georgie had built 5 massive chimneys in the valley, his own, Whipple's, and 3 others for families who had heard Whipple's testimony and were willing to pay $40 for the construction. Each chimney was tailored to the cabin's size and the family's needs. The smallest was a 2-foot wide, 3-turn zigzag for a bachelor's cabin that stored approximately 8,000 BTUs and extended the overnight warmth by 6 hours. The largest was a 3-foot wide, 7-turn zigzag for a farmhouse with 3 rooms that stored approximately 22,000 BTUs and maintained warmth for 14 hours after the fire died. Nino's contribution was the cooking surface. She observed that the chimney face, the surface radiating into the cabin, reached approximately 85 degrees during and immediately after the fire, which was too cool for cooking, but warm enough to maintain food at serving temperature. She installed a narrow wooden shelf along the chimney face at waist height, and during the evening she placed covered pots and dishes on the shelf, where the chimney's radiant heat kept them warm for hours. Breakfast porridge, prepared the previous evening and placed on the chimney shelf, was warm and ready to eat at 6 in the morning without relighting the stove, a small convenience that saved kindling, saved time, and meant that the family's first meal of the day was warm and waiting rather than cold and requiring 30 minutes of fire building before it could be prepared. Vakhtang, who was 16 by the winter of 1892, apprenticed with his father on the chimney construction projects and learned the masonry skills that the technique required. By 1895, Vakhtang was building chimneys independently, working faster than Georgie because he was younger and stronger, completing a standard 4-turn zigzag in 12 days rather than Georgie's 17. Vakhtang built 8 chimneys between 1895 and 1902, expanding the range of the technique into neighboring valleys where Georgie's reputation had spread, but where the distance had prevented him from working directly. The January 1896 blizzard, a 4-day storm that dropped temperatures to 22 below zero with sustained winds of 40 miles per hour, tested every chimney in the valley under extreme conditions. Georgie loaded his stove with a double charge of dense beech at 8 in the evening, approximately 16 pounds, and burned it hot for 3 hours, charging the chimney mass to approximately 100 degrees on the surface. The fire died at 11. The damper was closed to 1/8 open. The cabin temperature at 11 was 68 degrees. At 2 in the morning, the hour when every conventional cabin in the valley had someone stumbling to the stove, the cabin was 57 degrees. At 6, 48. At 8, when Georgie finally relit the stove, 44. 22 below zero outside. Fire dead for 9 hours, and the cabin was 44 degrees. Cold, but not freezing. Not dangerous. Not the 28 to 32 degrees that the conventional cabins had reached, where ice formed on the water basins and frost coated the interior walls. Whipple's smaller chimney performed proportionally. His dawn temperature during the same blizzard was 40 degrees, colder than Georgie's because the smaller mass stored less heat, but still 8 degrees above the 32 that his conventional chimney would have delivered. 8 degrees was the difference between a basin of water and a basin of ice, between a cold morning and a freezing one. The durability of the massive chimney exceeded every other component of the cabin. The stone, fieldstone from the Green Mountain glacial deposits, was effectively permanent, unaffected by heat cycling, weather, or age. The mortar, a mixture of lime, sand, and clay that Georgie formulated from Georgian tradition, hardened with age rather than deteriorating, gaining strength over years as the lime continued to carbonate. The iron damper, the only metal component, showed surface rust after 5 years, but remained structurally sound and functionally effective. The only maintenance required was an annual chimney cleaning. Removal of the creosote and soot that accumulated on the zigzag channel walls, which Georgie performed by lowering a weighted burlap sack on a rope through the chimney cap and pulling it through each turn of the zigzag. The cleaning took 2 hours and was performed in September before the heating season began. The massive chimney's 8,000-pound weight created a secondary structural benefit that Georgie had not anticipated, but that became apparent during the first severe windstorm. The chimney, rising from its own foundation through the center of the cabin and through the roof, acted as a massive anchor, a stabilizing mass that resisted the lateral forces of the wind that rocked lighter structures. The cabin with the massive chimney did not creak, did not shift, did not flex in the wind the way that conventional cabins did, because the 8,000 pounds of stone at its center held the structure in place like a keel holds a ship. 2 conventional cabins in the valley suffered structural damage during the November gale of 1891, shifted off their foundations by wind loading, while Georgie's cabin, anchored by its massive chimney, showed no movement at all. Georgie lived in the Green Mountain cabin until 1906, when he and Nino moved to Burlington to be closer to Ketevan and her family. Vakhtang continued building chimneys in the valley until 1910, by which time he had built a total of 13 massive chimneys across 3 townships. The technique never spread beyond the range of Georgie's and Vakhtang's personal labor because the construction required skills that could not be transmitted by description alone. The proportioning of the zigzag, the selection and fitting of the flue stones, the formulation and application of the heat-resistant mortar, the positioning of the damper, all required hands-on masonry experience that most frontier builders lacked. But within its range, the massive chimney was transformative. The 13 chimneys that Georgie and Vakhtang built served their families for decades, the stone structures outlasting the log cabins around them in many cases, standing as solitary monuments in clearings where the cabins had rotted and fallen, but the chimneys remained, warm stone hearts of vanished homes. The physics of the zigzag flue channel deserved examination because the geometry was the key to the system's performance and the detail that separated the massive chimney from a merely large one. A straight flue, even one surrounded by 3 feet of stone, would transfer relatively little heat to the stone mass because the hot gases would travel through the channel at high velocity, spending only a few seconds in contact with the stone walls before exiting the chimney cap. The contact time between the hot gas and the stone's surface determined how much heat transferred from the gas to the stone, and a straight 12-foot flue provided approximately 2 to 3 seconds of contact time at typical draft velocities, far too brief for significant heat transfer. The Zigzag changed the equation in 2 ways. First, it doubled the path length, 24 feet of channel in a 12-foot chimney, which doubled the contact time to approximately 5 to 6 seconds. Second, and more importantly, each 90-degree turn in the channel created turbulence in the gas flow. In a straight flue, the gas flowed in a smooth laminar pattern, with the hottest gas traveling through the center of the channel and relatively cooler gas hugging the stone walls, a pattern that minimized the contact between the hottest gas and the stone surface. Each turn in the Zigzag disrupted this laminar flow, tumbling the gas and mixing the hot center with the cooler edges, ensuring that the full temperature of the gas was exposed to the stone walls at every point in the channel. The turbulent mixing effect of the Zigzag turns was more important than the extended path length. It increased the effective heat transfer rate by a factor of approximately 3 compared to smooth laminar flow in a straight flue. The combined effect, doubled path length and tripled heat transfer rate, meant that the Zigzag flue extracted approximately 6 times more heat from the flue gases than a straight flue of the same height. The flue gas temperature at the chimney cap confirmed this: 120 degrees for the Zigzag versus 250 degrees for a straight flue, burning the same fuel at the same rate. The missing 130 degrees of heat energy, approximately 12,000 BTUs per 2-hour burn, was stored in the stone mass of the chimney, available for slow release into the cabin over the next 10 to 14 hours. The stone selection was critical and was the aspect of the construction that most clearly distinguished Georgie's work from a conventional mason's. Not all stone stores heat equally. The ideal stone for a thermal chimney was dense, non-porous, and thermally conductive, characteristics that Georgie evaluated by a combination of visual inspection, weight, and a test that he had learned from his father. He would strike the stone with a hammer and listen to the ring. A dense stone rang like a bell, a clear, high-pitched note that indicated tight crystal structure and high density. A porous stone thudded, a dull sound that indicated air pockets and low density. Georgie selected only the ringing stones for the flue channel walls, where heat transfer was critical, and used the duller stones for the exterior walls, where insulation was more important than conductivity. The best stones on the property were the dark gray granites from the creek bed, water-rounded boulders that had been tumbled and compressed by glacial action thousands of years ago, producing an extremely dense, non-porous stone with a specific heat capacity of approximately 0.19 British thermal units per pound per degree Fahrenheit. At this specific heat, 8,000 pounds of granite heated from 60 degrees to 100 degrees would store approximately 60,000 BTUs, enough thermal energy to release 1,000 BTUs per hour for 60 hours, or 2,000 BTUs per hour for 30 hours, or 3,000 BTUs per hour for 20 hours. In practice, the chimney did not heat uniformly to 100 degrees. The interior flue walls reached 140 degrees, while the exterior surface reached 85 degrees, creating a gradient that drove heat outward from the flue to the cabin. But the total stored energy of approximately 18,000 BTUs per standard 2-hour burn was consistent with the theoretical capacity of the stone mass. The mortar was a proprietary formulation that Georgie had learned from 3 generations of Georgian masons. Standard American lime mortar, a mixture of slaked lime, sand, and water, was adequate for exterior masonry, but failed in the high-heat environment of a flue channel, where repeated cycling between 400 degrees during the fire and ambient temperature after the fire caused the mortar to crack, crumble, and eventually fail, opening gaps in the flue that leaked smoke and reduced draft. Georgie's mortar included a proportion of calcitiate powder, calcium from crucite lime, mixed with fine river sand and a small amount of animal hair for tensile reinforcement. The modified mortar set harder, resisted heat cycling better, and gained strength over years rather than losing it, because the calcium component continued to react with atmospheric carbon dioxide in a slow carbonation process that converted the soft calcium hydroxide into hard calcium carbonate over a period of 5 to 10 years. By the 5th year, the mortar joints were harder than the stone they held, a reversal of the normal deterioration pattern in American masonry. The thermal lag of the massive chimney, the delay between the fire's heat input and the chimney's heat output, was approximately 45 minutes. During the first 45 minutes of a fire, the chimney absorbed heat faster than it radiated, and the cabin received most of its warmth directly from the stove. After 45 minutes, the chimney's exterior surface had warmed to the point where its radiant output became significant, and the cabin began receiving heat from 2 sources, the stove and the chimney, simultaneously. The dual heat source produced a distinctive temperature profile that Nino described as being like 2 fires burning in the same room. The stove's sharp directional heat warming the space directly in front of it, and the chimney's soft, even heat warming the entire room from floor to ceiling. The combined effect was a room temperature 5 to 8 degrees higher than the stove alone could achieve, with a much more uniform distribution. The corners were only 4 to 5 degrees cooler than the center, compared to 15 degrees cooler in a conventional cabin. The evening routine that Georgie and Nino developed around the massive chimney was a rhythm that the entire family followed through 17 Vermont winters. At 5 in the afternoon, Georgie loaded the stove with a full charge of seasoned beech, 8 to 10 pounds, and opened the draft fully. The fire burned hot and clean for 30 minutes, bringing the stove to full temperature and beginning the charge cycle for the chimney mass. At 5:30, Georgie reduced the draft to moderate, and the fire settled into a steady burn that continued for approximately 90 minutes. During this period, the cabin temperature rose to 65 to 68 degrees. The chimney surface temperature rose to 85 degrees, and Nino prepared the evening meal on the stovetop with the chimney shelf warming the serving dishes. At 7, the fire began to die, and Georgie added a small supplemental charge, 3 to 4 pounds of hardwood, that extended the burn to 8 o'clock and pushed the chimney surface temperature to its peak of approximately 90 degrees. At 8, the fire died. Georgie closed the damper to 1/4, and the family went about their evening activities in a cabin warmed by the radiant heat of 5 tons of warm stone. By 9:30, the family was in bed. The cabin temperature at bedtime was 63 degrees. The chimney would hold them warm until morning. The sound of the massive chimney was a detail that visitors noticed and that Nino considered an important feature. A conventional thin-walled chimney transmitted every sound of the outside world: wind, rain, sleet, animal calls, through the flue into the cabin with startling clarity, because the thin stone walls vibrated sympathetically with the air column in the flue. The massive chimney was silent. The 3-foot-wide stone mass absorbed sound as effectively as it absorbed heat, and the zigzag channel broke the direct acoustic path between the chimney cap and the cabin interior. On nights when the wind howled through the Green Mountains at 40 miles per hour, the cabin was quiet. The only sound the soft tick of the stove metal cooling and the faint hiss of the damper. Nino said the silence was worth as much as the warmth. The carbon monoxide risk of the damper was the most serious safety concern of the massive chimney system, and Georgie addressed it with a protocol that he taught to every family for whom he built a chimney. The damper must never be fully closed while any ember remained in the firebox. Even a single glowing coal produces carbon monoxide, a colorless, odorless gas that is lethal at concentrations above 200 parts per million. And a fully closed damper would trap this gas in the cabin. Georgie's rule was absolute. The damper may be closed to 1/4 open after the fire dies, but never fully closed until the firebox contains nothing but cold gray ash with no visible red, orange, or black coals. He demonstrated the test to every customer. Open the firebox door, look at the ash bed in dim light, and if any spot glows or appears dark, indicating a coal that is not yet fully ashed, the damper stays at 1/4. Only when the entire ash bed is uniformly gray, cold, and dead may the damper be closed further. This protocol was non-negotiable, and Georgie refused to build a chimney for any family that he believed would not follow it. The economics of the massive chimney over a 10-year period revealed the strongest cost-benefit ratio of any single improvement in the valley. Construction cost, $40. Materials plus Georgie's labor. Annual fuel savings, 1.5 cords at $6 per cord or $9 per year. 10-year fuel savings, $90. 10-year maintenance cost, $0. Annual cleaning was labor only, performed by the homeowner. Net 10-year benefit, $50. A return of approximately 125% on the initial investment. Over 20 years, the minimum expected lifespan of the stone structure, the net benefit exceeded $140, and the chimney itself showed no deterioration, no loss of performance, and no need for repair or replacement. The cultural legacy of the massive chimney in the Green Mountain Valley was unique among the frontier engineering adaptations because the technique could not separate from the builder. The straw cellar could be described in 10 minutes and built by any farmer. The sand bed could be copied from a single visit. The raised floor could be replicated by observation. But the massive chimney required Georgie's hands, or Vaktang's hands, because the critical details of the zigzag proportioning, the stone selection, the mortar formulation, and the damper operation could not be adequately transmitted by description. The technique was, in this sense, artisanal rather than vernacular, a craft that traveled with the craftsman rather than spreading through the community by imitation and adaptation. This limitation defined the massive chimney's reach. Within a day's travel of Georgie's cabin, the technique was available, and 13 families benefited from it. Beyond that radius, the technique was unknown. And when Georgie and Vaktang eventually stopped building, Georgie due to age, Vaktang due to a move to Boston in 1910, the technique stopped with them. No one in the valley possessed the skills to build a new zigzag chimney, and the existing chimneys, magnificent as they were, could not teach their own construction to the next generation. The chimneys themselves outlasted everything around them. In the abandoned clearings of the Green Mountains, where the cabins rotted and fell after the families moved away, where the forests reclaimed the pastures and the stone walls disappeared under moss and leaves, the massive chimneys stood. Solitary pillars of stacked fieldstone, 3 feet wide and 12 feet tall, rising from foundations of flat stone set deep in the earth, their zigzag flues still intact, their mortar joints still tight, their stone still ringing when struck. Monuments to a Georgian mason who understood that the heart of a home was not the fire, but the stone that remembered the fire long after the flames had died. The relationship between chimney mass and overnight performance followed a curve that Georgi mapped through observation across his 13 installations. The smallest chimney, 2 feet wide, 3 turns, approximately 3,000 pounds, stored approximately 8,000 BTUs and maintained cabin warmth for approximately 6 hours after the fire died, producing a dawn temperature roughly 10 degrees warmer than a conventional chimney. The medium chimneys, 2.5 to 3 feet wide, 4 to 5 turns, 5,000 to 8,000 pounds, stored 12,000 to 18,000 BTUs and maintained warmth for 8 to 12 hours, producing dawn temperatures 15 to 20 degrees warmer. The largest chimney, 3 feet wide, 7 turns, approximately 10,000 pounds, stored 22,000 BTUs and maintained warmth for 14 hours, producing a dawn temperature 22 degrees warmer than a conventional chimney under identical conditions. The curve was not linear. Doubling the chimney mass did not double the overnight performance, because the rate of heat release from the chimney was governed by the temperature difference between the stone surface and the cabin air, which diminished as the cabin cooled and the stone cooled toward equilibrium. The first 4,000 pounds of stone mass provided the most dramatic improvement, roughly doubling the overnight thermal coasting time. Additional mass beyond 4,000 pounds provided diminishing returns, worthwhile but less dramatic per additional pound. Georgi recommended a minimum of 4,000 pounds for any cabin expecting to face temperatures below zero, and advised that chimneys beyond 8,000 pounds were unnecessarily large for single-room cabins under 250 square feet. The seasonal charging pattern of the massive chimney revealed an effect that Georgi had observed in the tower houses of Chantilly, but that surprised his Vermont customers. During the heating season, November through March, the chimney underwent a gradual deep charging of its entire mass that went beyond the nightly cycle of surface heating and cooling. Each evening's fire heated the flue channel walls to 140 degrees and the exterior surface to 85 degrees. By morning, the surface had cooled to 70 degrees, but the deep interior of the stone mass, the material 2 to 3 inches behind the surface, had barely changed temperature because stone conducts heat slowly through its thickness. Over weeks of nightly fires, the deep interior temperature gradually rose, from the ambient 55 of October to approximately 65 by December to approximately 70 by February. This deep charging meant that the chimney's baseline temperature, the temperature it cooled toward overnight, was not the cabin's ambient temperature, but a higher temperature maintained by the accumulated heat in the deep stone. The practical effect was that the chimney performed slightly better in February than in November, because the deep mass was warmer and the overnight cooling curve started from a higher baseline. The reverse effect occurred in spring. When the heating season ended in March or April, the chimney retained its deep charge for weeks, radiating a gentle warmth into the cabin long after the stove had been shut down for the season. Nino appreciated this residual warmth during the cold mornings of April and early May, when the cabin no longer needed a fire during the day, but still benefited from the warmth stored in the chimney mass from the winter's accumulated heat. The creosote management in the Zigzag flue was more complex than in a straight flue, because the horizontal sections of the zigzag provided ledges where creosote could accumulate in thick deposits rather than being carried upward by the draft. Creosote, a flammable tar-like residue of incomplete combustion, was the primary fire hazard in any chimney, and a chimney fire in the massive stone structure would be a serious event. The dense creosote deposits in the zigzag turns would burn at extremely high temperatures, potentially cracking the mortar joints and damaging the stone. Georgi's prevention strategy was twofold. First, he burned only well-seasoned hardwood, beech, maple, oak, and birch with less than 20% moisture content, at moderate to high draft, which produced the cleanest combustion and the least creosote. He explicitly forbade the burning of green wood, softwood, spruce, pine, hemlock, or any material that produced heavy smoke, because the creosote from these fuels would accumulate rapidly in the zigzag turns. Second, he cleaned the zigzag channel annually, a process that involved lowering a weighted burlap sack through the chimney cap and pulling it through each turn, scraping the accumulated creosote from the ledges and collecting it at the firebox cleanout. The annual cleaning removed approximately 3 to 5 pounds of creosote from the zigzag channel, a modest accumulation that confirmed the effectiveness of the seasoned hardwood-only fuel policy. The draft characteristics of the zigzag channel differed from a straight flue in ways that required the stove operator to understand and accommodate. A straight flue drafted predictably, the taller the flue, the stronger the draft, and responded quickly to changes in fuel load and damper position. The zigzag flue drafted more slowly at startup because the cold stone mass of the turns absorbed heat from the initial gases and slowed the development of the temperature differential that drove the draft. Georgi's startup protocol addressed this. Begin with a small hot kindling fire, birch bark and dry pine splits, that produced high-temperature gases to warm the first 2 turns of the zigzag quickly, establishing the initial draft. Once the draft was established, indicated by a steady pull of air into the firebox, visible as a slight inward flutter of a strip of cloth held near the firebox door, the main fuel charge could be loaded, and the fire would sustain itself. The startup warm-up took approximately 10 to 15 minutes, longer than the 5 minutes required for a straight flue. But once established, the zigzag draft was remarkably stable, unaffected by wind gusts that could reverse the draft in a straight flue, because the zigzag turns acted as baffles that blocked external pressure fluctuations from reaching the firebox. The aesthetic presence of the massive chimney in the cabin was a quality that every visitor noted, and that Georgi, despite his practical orientation, clearly took pride in. The chimney face, 12 feet tall, 3 feet wide, built from carefully selected and fitted fieldstone with tight mortar joints, dominated the cabin interior like a stone wall in a cathedral. The stones were arranged with attention to color and texture, darker granites at the base grading to lighter stones above, with occasional pieces of quartz and feldspar that caught the firelight and sparkled. The chimney was not decorated. Georgi had no patience for ornament, but it was composed with the eye of a mason who understood that the beauty of stone was in its natural variation, and that careful selection and placement could make fieldstone as striking as dressed marble. Ketavan, who was 9 when the family arrived in Vermont and 27 when Georgi moved to Burlington, grew up in the warmth of the massive chimney and carried its memory into her own home. She married a school teacher named William Hathaway in 1906, and their house in Burlington, a conventional wood frame structure with a standard brick chimney, disappointed her every winter. She told William that the house would never be warm the way her father's cabin had been warm, because the chimney was too small and the walls were too thin, and the heat left the building as fast as the stove could produce it. William, who had never experienced the massive chimney, assumed his wife was remembering her childhood through the softening lens of nostalgia. He was wrong. Ketavan was remembering a specific, measurable, replicable thermal performance that her father had achieved through 4 tons of stone and a zigzag flue, and that no amount of modern framing and standard masonry could replicate. No myths, no miracles, just stone, mortar, a zigzag flue, and the understanding that the best chimney is not the one that carries heat away fastest. It is the one that captures the heat and gives it back.